The submitted material is a complex dystopian sci-fi manuscript exploring the fragile line between humans and androids in a post-apocalyptic world obsessed with empathy and artificial animals.
It is such a fascinating read, honestly.
Right, the world building is incredibly deep, so let's just dive right into the feedback. The alternating perspectives between the bounty hunter and the isolated special create excellent tension, but the thematic convergence in the climax risks feeling disjointed.
Yeah, it really comes down to a pacing and structural issue, I think, because when we look at how those two distinct perspectives interact when the pressure is at its absolute peak, there's a noticeable gap in the execution.
Right. As I understand it from the notes, we have these two parallel tracks running simultaneously. Like, on one track, you have the protagonist, the bounty hunter, actively hunting down these highly advanced fugitive androids. And then on the other track, you have the isolated, special character, someone deemed genetically unacceptable to emigrate off-world, who is actually sheltering these exact same androids in his decaying, empty apartment building.
It's just a beautifully set up dynamic. You have the predator and the protector moving toward an inevitable collision in the exact same physical space.
It really is a strong setup, but it all culminates in this massive television broadcast that exposes the world's core religion, Mercerism, as a complete fraud.
Right.
And this huge revelation drops right as the final physical confrontation between the bounty hunter and the androids kicks off. It's like two trains running on parallel tracks that arrive at the station simultaneously, but the passengers never seem to interact.
That is a great way to put it.
I wonder, though, does tying these two plot lines too closely together risk ruining the unique, tragic isolation of the special character? I mean, the author clearly wants that character walled off from the main action to preserve his distinct tragedy.
Oh, I completely see the instinct to keep the special in his own bubble. The weakness here, however, is that the television expose happens almost entirely within that isolated character's narrative scope.
Right. It's totally sequestered over there.
Exactly. Because it's sequestered, its massive philosophical weight doesn't immediately intersect with the protagonist's physical confrontation. So the two major climaxes of the entire manuscript, the ideological shattering of the world's religion and the physical retirement of the androids, they remain structurally siloed.
Which kind of diffuses the overall impact for the reader.
Yes, you're essentially asking them to process a philosophical earthquake in one chapter and a physical life or death struggle in the next, without letting the two elements actually touch.
It creates this sort of cognitive dissonance. You have the ideological climax happening in the living room and the action climax happening out in the hallway.
Yeah, the reader's basically reading two different climaxes at the exact same moment, but having to compartmentalize the action from the philosophy.
So how do we fix that?
The suggestion here is to weave the immediate fallout of the ideological expose directly into the physical confrontation. We need to force the physical action and the philosophical crisis to bleed into one another.
Which heightens the thematic stakes for the protagonist.
Exactly.
But how do we practically do that without having the bounty hunter just, stop shooting to watch television? The pacing of a shootout is all fast kinetic energy, and philosophy is inherently slow.
Right, you don't want to lose the momentum.
Yeah. If we pause the action for a theological debate, we lose the momentum of the thriller completely.
So, as a concrete example, you have to layer it acoustically or psychologically. First, the protagonist could actually hear the television broadcast echoing through the decaying apartment building's hallways during the final shootout.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. If the special character has his TV blaring, that audio can just bleed right into the stairwell. Imagine the protagonist cornering these androids, and the very foundation of human empathy is being publicly debunked on a booming television set just a few doors down.
That serves as a surreal philosophical soundtrack to the violence. That allows the reader to experience both climaxes simultaneously.
Precisely.
That definitely bridges the gap geographically, and it adds an eerie texture to the scene. But I'm looking at the tension of the sequence. Does just hearing a television in the background actually force the protagonist to engage with the idea, or is it just set dressing?
That's a valid question.
Like, is there a way to make it actively confrontational?
Well, if the author wants to push it further, here's another concrete example. The lead fugitive android could explicitly use the fraud revelation as a psychological weapon against the protagonist during their standoff.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the android knows the broadcast is happening. It could taunt the protagonist through the walls or across a barricade, basically saying, your religion is fake, your empathy is a lie, so what exactly makes you better than me?
Wow. That forces the protagonist to articulate his evolving understanding of empathy in real time, right as he has to pull the trigger.
Exactly.
That complicates the climax significantly. But if the android is taunting him with philosophy during a firefight, does that risk stalling the momentum? We see that sometimes in action sequences where the villain gives a long monologue and the kinetic energy just totally dies.
I mean, it only stalls the momentum if the dialogue isn't doing any heavy lifting. If the android's taunt actually makes the protagonist hesitate.
Oh, like a physical reaction.
Right, if it creates a physical misstep or causes him to lower his weapon for a fraction of a second, then the philosophy is actively driving the action. It becomes a tactical maneuver to survive, rather than a theatrical monologue.
It forces the bounty hunter to not just act, but to defend his entire existence under extreme duress.
Exactly.
Well, that real-time defensive empathy brings up a bigger issue with the manuscript structure regarding how narrative threats are sustained. So the introduction of the rival bounty hunter brilliantly serves as a dark psychological mirror for the protagonist, though his abrupt departure leaves a rich vein of narrative potential untapped.
It really does. It highlights a very common question in writing, which is, what do we do with the foil once they've served their initial introductory purpose?
Right. Let's look closely at the section discussing this rival. He's introduced as a ruthless foil who operates without any empathy for the androids whatsoever.
A stark contrast to our protagonist.
Yeah, our protagonist is starting to experience these really confusing, growing empathetic feelings toward his targets. And then the rival comes in, administers an empathy test, executes an android with chilling efficiency, and then effectively exits the story. I have to ask, isn't there a value to having a character simply serve as a catalyst for an epiphany and then clear out so the focus returns solely to the protagonist's internal journey? Sometimes a clean exit keeps the narrative uncluttered.
Oh, there is absolute validity in not cluttering the third act. Sometimes a catalyst just needs to be a catalyst. But the weakness here is that because the rival vanishes entirely after the protagonist's epiphany, he feels like a mechanical narrative device rather than a fully integrated, lingering threat within the world.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, the ideological conflict he introduces, this terrifying idea that a human can be more cold and robotic than the androids they hunt, is abruptly dropped rather than resolved. We just lose the tension of that mirror.
Yeah, I can see that. If you introduce a character who fundamentally challenges the protagonist's worldview, having them simply walk away means the protagonist never actually has to defeat that opposing worldview.
Right, they only have to defeat the physical antagonist, which in this case are the androids.
So what do we do about the rival?
The suggestion is to sustain this rival's presence or ideological threat into the manuscript's final act, to actively complicate the protagonist's moral choices. We don't just want the protagonist fighting the androids.
We want him fighting the ideology of the rival at the exact same time.
Exactly. We want to put him in a vice grip.
But how do we integrate him without overcrowding that final apartment sequence? If we have the protagonist, the special, the androids, and now the rival all converging, it could become pretty chaotic.
Well, for a concrete example, the rival could be assigned to assist the protagonist in the final apartment raid. If they are forced to work together, it forces the protagonist to actively protect the fugitive android from the rival's unnecessary cruelty before retiring them himself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it creates a deeply uncomfortable triangle. The protagonist has to stand between the prey he is mandated to kill
Right.
and the monstrous colleague he is supposed to ally with.
That definitely complicates the climax. But I'm looking at the ripple effects of that choice. Like, if we force the protagonist to protect the androids from the rival, does that risk making him look like a traditional hero or a savior rather than a conflicted hunter?
That is a very sharp observation.
Because the bleak tone of the manuscript seems to rely on the protagonist doing a terrible job, you know?
Yes, and if he becomes a shining shield for the androids, it totally subverts the dystopian tone. But protecting them doesn't have to be heroic. It can be entirely selfish.
How so?
He might protect them from the rival simply because he wants to execute them quickly and cleanly rather than watching the rival torture them. It becomes a battle over how to kill, which is incredibly grim and fits the tone perfectly.
That is dark.
It is. However, if we want to keep the final shootout isolated to avoid overcrowding, we can utilize the rival later in the narrative.
Later, as in the denouement?
Yes. As an alternative example, the rival could be the one who destroys the protagonist's newly purchased live animal later in the narrative.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah. In the current draft, it's one of the fugitive androids who pushes the protagonist's goat off the roof. But what if the rival does it?
Oh, man.
But rival might view the protagonist's newfound empathy and his desperate attempt to connect with a real animal as a betrayal of their hardcore, cold-blooded profession, like a betrayal of humanity that must be severely punished.
Wow. Let me weigh the pros and cons of that. Because if the rival kills the goat, it cements the central theme of the manuscript, right? That humans who lack empathy are far more destructive than the androids who are simply trying to survive.
Exactly.
But on the flip side, does having the human rival do it let the androids off the hook too easily? We don't want to make the androids pure, innocent victims. They are genuinely dangerous.
They are dangerous, and they absolutely should remain so. But by the time the goat is killed, the protagonist has already retired all the androids.
Right. The physical threat is gone.
Yes. So if the rival kills the animal, it shifts the final realization. The protagonist realizes that killing the androids didn't actually fix the world because the real rot is the loss of human empathy, personified by his colleague. It's a much more devastating realization.
That makes a ton of sense from a thematic standpoint. It transitions the narrative from a simple survival story to a tragedy about the loss of human connection.
Exactly.
And that transitions us perfectly to the final pages. The closing sequence carries immense emotional weight, yet the tonal shift regarding the discovery of the artificial toad risks muddying the protagonist's final resolution.
Endings like this are notoriously difficult. The author is trying to land an incredibly nuanced emotional state, and getting the tone right requires immense precision.
Let me outline the ending mechanics so we can analyze them. We have a desolate, exhausting conclusion. The protagonist buys a live animal, a goat, at great expense to reclaim his humanity. The goat is murdered. Devastated and exhausted from retiring the final androids, he flies his hovercar up north into the radioactive, deserted wasteland of Oregon. And out there in the dust, he finds a toad.
Right.
He thinks it's a real living animal, which would be an absolute miracle. But then he realizes it has a control panel. It's mechanical.
Yeah.
And his reaction in the draft is basically a quiet shrug. He says, "I'm glad to know." I have to say I really appreciate the quietness of this ending. In real life, after intense trauma, people don't usually have massive theatrical epiphanies. They just feel numb.
That's very true.
So is there a risk that if we make his reaction to the artificial toad too profound, it breaks the realistic, utter exhaustion of the character?
I absolutely validate the need for exhaustion. And you are right about real-life trauma. The weakness, however, is that while numbness is realistic to write, in fiction, it robs the reader of catharsis.
I can see that.
The protagonist's rapid, almost shrug-like acceptance comes immediately after extreme emotional highs and lows. So this abrupt tonal shift can read as detached resignation or apathy rather than a profound, synthesized thematic statement about the value of all life, artificial or real. Numbness just leaves the thematic loop open.
So for an author listening, writing an authentic trauma response might actually work against the structural need for a narrative resolution.
Yes.
It currently reads a bit like he just doesn't care anymore, rather than him achieving a state of enlightened acceptance.
Right. We don't want the reader thinking he's just numb or that the entire journey was pointless. We want the reader to feel that his definition of empathy has fundamentally expanded to include the things that society tells him are worthless.
Okay, so what's the fix?
The suggestion is to ground the protagonist's final reaction in a more visceral, tactile action that connects directly back to the manuscript's core tenets of empathy and connection. He needs an active resolution, not a passive one.
We need him to physically do something with the toad, rather than just look at it, sigh, and put it in his pocket.
Exactly.
But how do we give him an active moment without it feeling completely out of character for someone who is so depleted?
Well, as a concrete example, the protagonist could use his empathy box one last time while holding the mechanical toad.
Oh, the empathy box.
Right. Throughout the manuscript, the empathy box is the specific technological device how humans connect with the collective suffering and joy of humanity. It's like an exclusive club for living things.
By grasping the handles of the box while cradling this fake toad in the desert, he is visually demonstrating that artificial life can still be a valid conduit for genuine connection. He's bridging the gap between the organic and the mechanical.
That's a very striking visual. But I'm questioning the mechanics of the empathy box itself. Does using the box in that moment imply he still relies on the system, or does it imply he has hijacked the system to serve his new worldview?
It definitely implies a hijacking. He is taking the ultimate symbol of human exclusivity and extending its grace to the mechanical world.
That's powerful.
It is. However, if we want to rely less on the world's technology and more on his personal agency, there is another way.
Let's hear it.
As another concrete example, the protagonist could notice a small mechanical flaw in the toad and gently repair it.
A repair scene? Does that risk feeling overly sentimental?
It could, if handled poorly.
Yeah, because we're in a radioactive wasteland after a day of brutal killings. If he pulls out a tiny screwdriver and fixes a robot frog, it might veer into, like, a Disney ending. We want to avoid sentimentality.
It all depends on the prose. It absolutely shouldn't be bright or cheerful. It should be gritty, exhausted, and really slow.
Right.
His hands are probably shaking, he's covered in dust. But by carefully fixing a wire or a gear in the toad out in the middle of this dead wasteland, the protagonist demonstrates an active, tender care for the artificial.
That's a great contrast.
Yeah, it mirrors an earlier moment in the manuscript where the isolated special character tries to care for a mechanical cat. It contrasts sharply with the world's general indifference, and it proves that his capacity to nurture has survived the trauma of the day.
I see the utility in that. It turns a passive moment of resignation into an active, deliberate choice. He's choosing to care for the discarded junk of the world.
Exactly.
It proves he hasn't lost his humanity. He has actually evolved it. It's a very small physical movement, but the underlying mechanics of that action provide the exact catharsis the reader needs to close the book feeling satisfied.
It just grounds the vast philosophical questions of the manuscript into one very small, understandable action.
Well, this has been an incredibly rigorous breakdown of narrative mechanics. Let me just quickly recap our 3 actionable structural areas for the listener.
Go for it.
First, we need to tighten the structural convergence of the dual climaxes. Let the philosophical broadcast echo directly into the physical shootout to heighten the cognitive tension and avoid siloed pacing. Second, extend the rival bounty hunter's presence into the late-stage narrative. By doing this, he serves as an active, lingering moral threat that challenges the protagonist's ideology rather than just a dropped catalyst.
Right.
And finally, ground the final emotional beat with the mechanical toad in a tactile demonstration of empathy, shifting the tone from detached apathy to active, profound acceptance gives the reader the necessary catharsis.
The manuscript is tackling incredibly dense questions about what defines humanity. And by tightening these specific structural levers, the author ensures that those questions hit the reader with maximum impact, rather than getting lost in the pacing.
Exactly. So, to the listener who submitted this, please take these structural suggestions, apply them to your next draft, and submit your revised work again for a future critique. We really want to see how these adjustments alter the flow of the climax.
Absolutely, we'd love to read it again.
When you step into the muddy, complex waters of a world where empathy is both a weapon and a salvation, the mechanics of how you tell that story are just as important as the story itself. Keep refining, and we look forward to reading the next iteration.